Welcome to Deep Focus. I'm Matt,
And I'm Nate.
and tonight we're talking about Terrence Malick's To the Wonder from 2012.
Well, released in the U.S. in 2013. But
Yeah.
I think hit the film circuits, the film festival circuits in 2012.
Yeah, Venice, I think, was where it premiered. So Terrence Malick, we've talked about him a couple times in our podcast, Criterion Chat. We talked about Thin Red Line and
Tree of Life.
Tree of Life most recently.
And this would be kind of a natural follow-up to the Tree of Life, as far as a conversation, but as well as from his career. It was the next movie he made after it. And
Yeah.
very much kind of continues the kind of filmmaking, the sort of experimental filmmaking that he began doing more robustly at this point in his career.
Yeah, I thought this would be an interesting film to discuss for several reasons. I mean, I have kind of a personal connection to this film we can get into, but just from the standpoint of Malick's career and what this film really symbolizes, this may be our least viewed video of all time.
I was also thinking as I watched it, or was watching it again, I was thinking, what exactly are we going to talk about? it's a film that you really have to see and kind of just respond to, on an emotional level, on a visceral level. It's not like there's a plot really to talk about. There's not much that it doesn't really flesh out its characters, so you can clearly necessarily decide this is the motivating principle behind everything. It's a story in the loosest sense of that word.
Yeah, even so, I would say it has more of a plot thread to it than some of his subsequent films, like
Definitely.
Night of Cups. But it's a film that, I've come back to many times, and it's actually probably my second favorite Malick film now, behind The Thin Red Line. Viewers probably know by now that Thin Red Line's my favorite film of all time, and we mentioned that on several occasions. So definitely a big Malick fan, but I'm not someone that immediately loves everything he does. Some of his later films in particular haven't really resonated with me, but this one in particular has, and it's an interesting film because I feel like it's one that a lot of people dismiss or forget about, and one that's very divisive as well. There seems to be very polarized opinions about this film and just his later films in general, right? So we probably should just start by talking about where this film fits into Malick's filmography, into his catalog. So Malick famously started with Badlands and Days of Heaven, two films that made a big impact in the 1970s. And that massive 20-year hiatus, came back with Thin Red Line. And from that point on, Thin Red Line does have a more traditional story structure in many ways.
It's kind of the blending of the two. You have Badlands is by far his most sort of straightforward linear film. It's his most experimental in terms of the editing. There's a little bit of it. There's some elliptical elements, and there's voiceover narration right there. But it's following clearly a paradigm for that Lovers on the Lamb kind of formula, but it's also got his very unique voice to it.
Yeah.
Days of Heaven starts experimenting a little bit more, and then The Thin Red Line is sort of the perfect hybrid of that big budget, massive kind of movie, and then also this very meandering philosophical tone that he likes to bring to the work. That I think he then after that film, well, I guess the New World kind of kept that up a little bit too, but he starts moving more and more into, I'm not interested in screenplays. I'm not interested in really fleshing out characters or understanding the character in a traditional sense of how we might present them, which, like you said, is polarizing. And I think this film definitely is polarizing. I was watching it in the theater when I first saw it, and it was a matinee showing back in the spring of 2013, and it was a little art house theater. And there's me and there's two middle-aged women in the theater that were clearly there, probably in their mid-50s. And at the very end of it, I remember one of them saying to the other, well, at least it had nice pictures. So I don't know what they expected to be watching as they watched it.
Yeah.
But I definitely was watching this again. I thought, my goodness, who would I recommend this movie to? Because
it's tough.
Either you're going to embrace it or not. I think we both embrace this film. And I can admit there's some flaws with it.
Yeah, for sure.
But I think overall it still is a movie that is emotionally moving to me. Mostly actually from the Javier Bardem part than the actual story with Ben Affleck and his love affairs, I guess we could say. But it is a movie that just speaks to me.
Yeah, me too. I mean, it connects to me really on a spiritual level, and ultimately, I think Malick's films, especially his later films, are kind of a Rorschach test in many ways. And not to say that if you don't respond to it, you're, you know, spiritually bankrupt or something like that. I mean, it's just stylistically, it either speaks to you or it doesn't. And again, some of his later films haven't really connected with me the same way. But as you said, Thin Red Line was really a blending of those styles, right? You could really see where his voice was going in certain sequences in that film. This film is really, I think, the first time he goes all in on that style, right? Goes all
Much
in.
more so even than The Tree of Life, which
Yeah.
The Tree of Life has more of the, and of course, anybody wants to hear our full thoughts on that one, just listen to our podcast.
Yeah.
But that one has, I think, a much more ambitious scope in terms of what it's trying to do. It has the dinosaurs, it has the eschaton, it has this massive sort of surreal element. This one doesn't really have any of that. It becomes much more mundane. And he becomes more fascinated, I think, with the mundane. People walking around a house and not talking to each other, which you think about on a day-to-day basis. How often is that taking place in your house, right? I mean, it's not like I'm always sitting around my house, like having some great conversation with
Yeah.
somebody. You just often are sitting in a room doing something. And other people are around, or maybe you're there all on your own too. I mean, it's just kind of the way life is, right? And he in this film, I think, pivots towards that and becomes, you used the word spiritual. I think he is really kind of a spiritual filmmaker at this point in his career. And he kind of makes that pivot up. I'm trying to find the hidden realities that are at work in this very mundane story.
He's trying to find those transcendent moments, right? That I think we all experience, even day to day, if you really kind of stop and pay attention.
You say, Christ said this, Christ said that. What do you say? And what you say, does it come from God within? Answer that which is of God in every woman, every man.
And it's interesting because the fact that he doesn't function with a formal script, I think, helps those moments to develop organically, right? So he's placing actors into scenarios that he may, give them a very loose framework as to what's going on, but the dialogue isn't cemented. The credit says written and directed by Terrence Malick, but I wonder what that screenplay really looked like, right? Yeah. I mean, if there really was a written document, it's a starting place and really not much more than that. And a lot of actors, you listen to interviews, and I think some actors flourish in this setting and some really struggle.
Terry told me more or less where was the frame of the character. Like, he won't go that way, he will go this way. Based on that, I read some books, I saw some documentaries. There was this amazing documentary of Mother Teresa de Calcutta.
The fact that you're creating this environment where the actors really do have to improvise and do have to interact in unique ways can create some of these moments that do end up in the film. I mean, I think about little bits like Olga Kurylenko's character when they're looking at washing machines and she's got that hose and she's like blowing air into that hose. Little moments like that, making that little noise, probably improvised, right? I mean, who knows? Malick maybe told her to do that, but it's little bits like that kind of stick with you, and those are the moments in life that you remember sometimes. So I love how this film takes the time to feature those moments.
I think you're right. I mean, it is obviously a very much a kind of setting that I think certain actors will or won't do well in.
Yeah.
Fascinating that he has some of the cast he does for that. And of course, we should also note that there's certain people that were cast in this movie that aren't in it. Rachel Weisz, probably one of the more prominent names, at this point was already an Academy Award-winning actress and makes the movie and then gets cut out of it. So
yeah.
You worked with Terry Malick once, didn't you?
Yes.
On The New Land?
Yeah.
What kind of experience was that?
My character was certainly not in the scene that I thought I was in, in the editing room. It was very strange.
It is
and
odd.
He completely unbalances everything.
Did you write
I'll
that?
never work with him again.
that just tells you, I can see why certain people have a hard time working with Malick, because how frustrating would it be to work on something and then have your whole part taken out, right? But Ben Affleck is not the kind of actor I would assume you'd put in this kind of
You
role.
wouldn't think so,
And I
yeah.
think if I recall correctly, Christian Bale was going to be the actor.
He was.
And then I don't know if it was because of scheduling conflicts or something he had to pull out, and then they replaced him with Ben Affleck, who at that time hadn't quite hit his, he's had a roller coaster of a career. I think he was coming just off of Argo, so he was really high, and he hadn't quite had his meltdown. So, but
I remember him saying in an interview that, yeah, he was quite tired of movie making and wanted to take a break, and Malick offered this picture, and he basically said this is the only director that would have got him to make another movie at that time.
right, so there you go. But I do kind of like him. I mean, there's something about his physical presence as Neil, who's our protagonist, and really a stand-in for Malick, because this film's based on, I guess, in the early 80s, he met a woman in France. They fell in love, they married, and then eventually the marriage fizzled out. But it seems to be a loose inspiration for that real life occurrence, a loose inspiration for this film that we're watching here. But as Neil, who really is this enigma, I think he works well, because clearly Neil is trying to find something and knows something's wrong. And of course, that is maybe one place where the film it's a little obvious on its symbolism, as he's the environmental inspector, and you can tell it there's something wrong with the land.
Yeah.
So it's maybe the one place
nature,
where,
yeah, nature is in disharmony, right?
yeah, there's one place where it's pretty on the nose. You're like, I know what you're doing. But I think, just to see Neil's journey to the point where you get to the final element of this film, which I guess I won't necessarily say right now what that is, but I think, having Affleck in this part really works. I guess we're actually kind of becoming Ben Affleck's fan channel here, because we did the Pearl Harbor review. I didn't really think about that till just now, but it's just, he does work well in this movie.
Yeah. Yeah, he does. I mean, he's an actor, I think, that is underrated in general. I mean, a lot of people just give him a hard time. I've never had a big problem with him as an actor. I mean, he has good moments and bad moments, like most actors. But yeah, he does well here. You know, it's interesting. We talked about how some actors work well in this environment, some don't. And I think both him and Olga Kurylenko really have a great kind of synergistic relationship between the two of them on screen, and they don't. They're never really self-aware in terms of the camera. So the camera is very fluid here, right? And the characters are constantly moving. The camera's constantly moving. Emmanuel Lubezki's cinematography, beautiful, just staggering, right?
But nobody but him could make a Sonic look as majestic as he manages to make it look through his lighting and his movement of the camera.
And it's interesting because the camera really has kind of a God's eye view to a lot of the action, right? And that's just by the nature of the lens choices. So a lot of wide angle lenses, deep
Natural
focus,
lighting.
natural lighting, a lot of steady cam. And I think that kind of photography really would make a lot of actors uncomfortable, because for him to accomplish a lot of these shots, the camera has to be very, very close to the actors. And if you see some of the behind the scenes footage, you actually see how close the lens is to the action. And that can be pretty intrusive for some actors. And I think Rachel McAdams is not quite as successful with her performance in that regard. She always seems to give the sense that she's aware that the camera's there, whereas I don't get that sense from Olga Kurylenko and Ben Affleck. But as you mentioned, the story starts in Paris. The two of them meet. And Affleck's character invites Marina, who's Olga Kurylenko's character, to live with him back in Oklahoma.
Along with her daughter, Tatiana.
Yeah. So it's this, one of the most beautiful transitions that reminded me of Lawrence of Arabia in many ways, between Paris and, the open fields of Oklahoma. And the source music in this film, I think, is really brilliant and really well chosen. And there's a real sense of, the American dream, kind of that pastoral sort of quality to starting anew. And it does evoke the imagery of these great open fields moving westward. There's kind of a Western quality to the film and its visuals that I find interesting as well. But it ultimately is a relationship film, right? It's about these
It's
two
a romance
characters.
story,
It's a
yeah.
romance, and how these two people interact, how they have that initial infatuation stage, how they fall out of favor with each other, and just how they interact with nature and the environment. As you said, there's a lot of time just spent in houses and wandering around. There's a lot of unpacking and packing of boxes. It seems like they live in 3, 4 houses during the course of the film. And it's
And
never
no
really
house really ever
explained.
seems that lived in, by the way. It
Yeah,
always looks like there's nothing really settled. There's not a lot on the walls and stuff like that.
and that's just a result, I think, of the production.
Right.
I mean, I think it's intentional too, just from a visual standpoint, to symbolize how they don't really have roots, right? And they're not able to establish the roots that maybe they want to establish as a couple.
Mm-hmm.
But also the fact that they were shooting in locations that were clearly new housing developments. So just on a personal note, I recently took a road trip with my family down to that area of the country. So we went through northeast Oklahoma, including Bartlesville, which is where most of this film was shot. Probably one of the few people in the history of film fandom that
Travels to
went
Oklahoma
to an
to-
area to scout locations or to visit locations from To the Wonder, but I did that. And beautiful town. Part of the film was also shot in Pawhuska, which is in the Osage Hills, which is just west of Bartlesville. And this is an area that's very personal for Malick because his family grew up there, or he grew up there, I should say, at least part of his childhood. And I think he even lived there as an adult for a period of time as well. And the setting is very, very important here, right? So just this idea, again, of a new beginning. Malick, of course, is very in tune to nature, and like Tarkovsky uses the imagery of nature to communicate what's going on with characters, and there's really a sense of disharmony, I guess, between nature and the characters in this film. You mentioned Affleck being this environmental worker, right, where he's testing the water.
The storytelling or the conveying of information really is entirely dependent upon the cinematography. And as you said, it's Emmanuel Lubezki, who is famous 3-time Oscar winner. I mean, he was right at this point hitting that big stride of his commercial and critical success. Followed up with this film and Gravity, Birdman, The Revenant, right? So, and of course had a very successful career leading into this film too. I mean, great cinematographer, and really is one of the leading cinematographers in terms of how to use available light to create images. And there's a kind of coldness in the imagery here,
Yeah.
which I think highlights a little bit what you're talking about there, where the sense of the discordant nature of the relationship, and giving that sort of passive view, that free-flowing camera very much does have sort of a God's eye view of things, or at least a ethereal view of things, right? That does seem kind of uninvested in the characters, right? The camera, you feel like it could almost disappear at any point in time to go follow another story.
Yeah.
And I think that is part of why maybe audiences aren't overly enthusiastic about this film, why it doesn't seem to have the same kind of fanfare of some of Malick's other work, because it does seem to have a much more somber cinematography that, as beautiful as it is, and as majestic as it is at certain times, you have these vistas that could easily, with that scope frame and everything, be made to look like the great Hollywood romances, and never really does. I mean, as gorgeous as it looks at times, it's a very different kind of gorgeousness.
Yeah, it does keep you at a distance, and the editing plays a big role in that too. I mean, it's a very fragmented picture, right? I mean, we're jumping back and forth between many different locations, and it's very hard geographically to get your bearings right. And I think that's intentional. But I also think that they were just shooting in a bunch of different spots and ended up just using a lot of footage.
Yeah,
from different
whatever
areas.
inspired Malick in his editing process.
And I think a lot of people look at this film and just call it pretentious, right? I mean, it's people whispering lines of voiceover and very poetic.
I thought I knew you. Now I don't think you ever were.
And there is
sort
a
of
bit. I mean, I think
images.
that is a somewhat fair criticism of the film. I think.
I think so. And the first time I viewed it, I felt that way to a degree as well. And there were parts of it I found fairly obnoxious, actually. But it was one that just drew me in, and with repeat viewings, I really started to appreciate it more. The film, progresses, and the relationship between Neil and Marina fragments, and
She goes home to Paris.
she goes home to Paris, and then he reconnects with an old friend played by Rachel McAdams.
Neil's basically kind of distant and just unwilling to commit or really give himself to another person. That's really what this film is centering on, is his unwillingness to connect with another human being.
Yes, I mean, she's clearly a religious character and asks him to pray with her at one point, and he just really can't do that. And they have a hard time connecting, and they eventually separate as well. And Marina returns.
Marina is also a very religious character, and she's drawn to this Father Quintana, played by Javier Bardem, who we see him in his own kind of crisis of faith as well. That seems to be, in some ways, paralleling what's taking place with Neil. But at the same time, he is actively trying to create bonds with people and seems not to be able to connect in himself, right?
What you got to say about it? Got to have a little more excitement. Just like when me and you were around, when ain't nobody around, just, hey, the power hit you, brother. It always hit me. You can just say, hey, power, and it hit me. Or hit me before I can get it out. See, the devil don't know what I'm saying, and you won't know, or I won't know. I can feel the warmth of the light, brother. That's spiritual.
He's faking it, as he says in some of his narration. And how long can I keep doing this is kind of what he's grappling with. Whereas Neil is not even really attempting to connect with other people and sort of feeling broken down, right? But I think that that idea that these two women in their own ways are kind of drawing Neil towards something larger is a fascinating thing, and you certainly see a lot of that in relationships where a person is spiritual, religious, and the other one kind of gets drawn into it, even if they aren't naturally drawn towards it. They might go to church, or they might pray just because, well, the person I'm with is doing that. And
Sure.
I think that reality is captured very nicely in this movie.
Yeah. I kind of wanted to save Bardem for last, because I think there's a lot to talk about with his character. Some of the most powerful and heartbreaking imagery, I think, in this film comes from his segments, and him, trying to spread the gospel among some of the poor communities depicted in the film, and just him wandering kind of from house to house, trying to find someone and speak with someone, and is quite moving. And Bardem, I think, does very well. He has a real sense of brokenness to his character. I was getting kind of echoes of Ingmar Bergman in his character as well. Just this, man who clearly is devout and has faith, but is struggling to reconcile what he believes with what he's seeing in the world in a very real way. Ben Affleck's character, we see him trying to deal with his own inadequacies, or deal with his own questions by shadowing him in a way. So there's some of those scenes as well, and there are some moments in those parts where Ben Affleck generally looks uncomfortable on screen, which is kind of interesting. I think Malick probably put him in situations maybe to get some of those genuine reactions. But it really culminates in, I would say, one of the most powerful sequences Malick's ever put to film, which is his Father Quintana's monologue, I think based on
St. Patrick.
Prayer of St. Patrick. So Christ before me, that monologue is just so powerful.
With the
And
Gorecki Symphony Number 3.
which is one of my favorite pieces of classical music, is the Symphony of Sorrowful Songs, which is actually all three parts make an appearance in this film. I think all three parts do at various points, but that sequence specifically uses the first movement.
I remember the first time I saw her was involuntary.
Boy, it was so much fun. We had a glorious time.
Cristo a mi derecha.
Although he didn't work us very much, he let them forgive.
Cristo a mi izquierda.
And it's just an astounding piece of filmmaking, I think.
Yeah, I know it is. It really does lead to. I mean, it's the climax of the film.
Yeah.
Such as this film has a climax. I
Yeah,
guess.
it's true.
But it is really kind of the culmination of the film's spiritual interest, and the whole point. It's called To the Wonder, and ultimately, I think the film's about the wonder of forgiveness. Really, is what it really ultimately comes down to. How do people forgive?
Yeah, that's what the film comes to. Yeah.
In that sequence, really, I think that's what Quintana is helping Neil to find, is the ability to forgive and to work in a broken world, right? Because that's really ultimately what Quintana's been struggling with. I'm around all this brokenness all the time, and how do I keep up, right? And how do I continue to care without being broken myself, right? Because it's so oppressive.
And the film kind of ends with a coda where it seems like Marina and Neil have parted ways, and Neil has his own family. There's a brief shot where he's in a different house again, and we see two small children kind of running around.
So did you interpret that as they had parted?
I always got that sense that.
I always took the opposite. I took it that they reconciled and that they came together and they had a home and a family.
Maybe. I mean, it's open to interpretation. It
Very much
certainly
so.
is. Yeah. And I mean, there's that moment at the airport where they part ways, right? But you never really see them back together at the end of the film. So maybe they did come together. But my sense was they parted ways, and he found someone else and started a family, and she was kind of meant to be on her own. That's the sense I got from the film.
Huh.
Yeah.
Well, I just think that would defeat it. If it's about forgiveness, it seems like that would defeat the whole point. Like, there's a reconciliation of the two.
Not necessarily. I think they still forgive each other. It doesn't necessarily mean they would end up together.
Know each other in that love that never changes.
Why did this?
Just not like a cloud in the sky. The man who makes a mistake can repent.